Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 24th of October, and today we're looking at really important Russian advances all across the Donetsk front. We're going to begin by looking at the really area east of Pokrovsk, the Pokrovsk front line, but really the majority of the video will be focusing on the fast-paced advances that are occurring from the eastern parts of Selydove all the way into the city center. We're going to look at the unit compositions in the area. We're going to look at topography and supply lines. We'll also look further southwards at developments around Ukrainian, Novoselidivka, Izmailivka, Vavcha Riverfront, really important. Also Kurakhove, and of course the Bohoyavlenka axis. So I do apologize for not being able to cover in today's video developments that are occurring around Terny, also around Toretsk and Kursk. I just don't have the time to do it, and my Wi-Fi is just really acting up recently. But I promise that I'll really go in detail about everything eventually sometime this weekend. But let's begin by looking at the beginning of the video at Lysivka, because you do have a concerted Russian effort here using armored columns to break through past the eastern part of the village, where the Russian forces are known to have dismounted and created a foothold for future attacks. It's just that the Ukrainians from the 25th Air Assault Brigade, they have at least one battalion that is really defending here tooth and nail. That this is their primary objective, this one battalion, while the other battalions from the 25th Brigade are operating further southwards, not necessarily around Selydove, but actually a bit further south around the Sukarnia region. So they do have split responsibilities, but they have released recently footage to Deep State, and they've shown how they're able to repel these Russian assaults that are occurring along a relatively narrow corridor, because Lysivka really is divided by this one main, over here is diagonal, but then eventually becomes horizontal road. And it is a very important road because it connects to the highway, this vertical highway, that then leads across all the very dense trenches south of Pokrovsk all the way into the city itself. So that's a part of the rationale behind attacking in this region, because of the sort of route that it leads you towards. But again, we're going to look at much more substantial updates right now around Selydove. So if you recall, Selydove really began to heat up around late August. This is when there were a lot of fears, and it became palpable, this feeling that Selydove would fall rather quickly. That's when the Ukrainians, they made an important shift in their unit composition and were able to really create a steady front line. This is in large part due to the work of the 15th National Guard Brigade, so they do deserve credit for that, as they were rushed in after facing low intensity combats in the Zaporozhye region for a very long time, being thrusted into an area with high intensity combats and being able to stop the Russian assault, albeit the Russians that were engaged in the offensive activities that had already been involved in attacks for about a month, and really fast-paced attacks. So also from a Russian perspective, it's understandable that they wouldn't have been able to continue it into a really, really dense city and just a very large urban cluster. So it is understandable from both perspectives why it eventually ended up settling along the eastern outskirts of Selydove, the front line, really with this dividing line. You could see it over here because I have the light red polygons showing the previous Russian front line before the advances of the past 3 days. And then in yellow, those are the gains since my last video, which I believe now has been 3 days since I uploaded. And in that time period, so much has happened. It's just something that happens to me sometimes when I'm on a hiatus, just a lot of developments. And so you could see in yellow, these are the Russian advances. We're going to go through the axes responsible for these yellow advances. So first of all, the Russian forces really have been, ever since, not necessarily focusing on advancing directly through Mikhailivka, because there were attempts to do so. There were attempts to do so in early September, and those not really materialized. And this is because of the reinforcements, the fresh reinforcements, at the very least several thousand troops that were operating in this arena. And also because the Russian vehicles, they were attacking along very specific routes that could be monitored by the Ukrainians, and they conducted hit and run attacks with infantry, but also drones dropping grenades onto individual Russian soldiers, FPVs, and of course the Ukrainians, their own vehicles targeting Russian tanks as they were advancing along some of these narrow corridors. And so it just locked off, sealed off these routes for the Russians. It was just simply not something that they were willing to waste more resources and men on at that point. And so the Russian forces, they shifted towards undermining the flanks of Selydove from the north, of course, with a lot of the aftermath of Novohordivka. And that's how you see now the Russians in control of territory that is actually about 3 kilometers west of that town, including this really important mine and landfill. And at the same time, On the southern axis, this has been way more fruitful, and you can see how basically Ukrainsk was used as a center of operations ever since September 14th to then branch out and expand and take over additional polygons. You can see that over here on my map. Time after time, the Russian forces chipping away at these large swaths of open fields, eventually reaching, again, various terracons and strong points, and eventually reaching specifically this rail axis with the windbreaks, and in the process also taking over Tsurkurnia, having Tsurkurnia sort of solidified the Russians' control over the southern flank of the Selydove region, because then from there they could branch off, utilizing the windbreaks for protection, for concealment for their troops, and then also armored attacks occurred in tandem northwards. Then at the same time, they started branching out westwards, taking over the entirety of Tsurkurnia, even west of the red line. And this was done for several reasons. First of all, there was a clear path through which to advance, which allowed for more preservation of life. That is completely understandable. And then by setting up like a forward foothold, it allowed the flanks to then sort of consolidate afterwards by utilizing the rail axis as, the nexus of all of that, the connector. So that was very important. But also you can see that south of Selydove, you don't have that much density when it comes to dugouts or fortifications. So you have this like 3 kilometer piece of territory, this large open field region that is also very conducive for Russian armored assaults. So we saw some of those unfold, not too large in their extent, but just large enough to successfully dismount Russian forces in local gullies or ravines. And then those troops begin to branch out along tree lines. And that, again, set up the base for the Russian forces to get control over the southern flank. And again, another advantage is that these fields over here overlook Selydove. I'm marking them with an X. They're not necessarily on that high of an elevated surface, but given the fact that Selydove is located in a river valley, the Solona River just bisects the entire city. Everything surrounding it from all directions, especially from this eastern direction, completely overlooks Selydove, and it's even more pronounced when you're comparing the, lowest elevated region of Selydove to the highest elevated terracons that now the Russians are taking over. For instance, the Kurakhove mine to the north. So that's really important to keep in mind. Ukrainsk and all of the strip of territory that sort of branches north of that town along this highway that I'm marking in red for you guys, it's on rather high elevation. And on a larger perspective, when you're looking at mortars being fired or just a vantage point for scouts, it actually is very important for the local geography to be in the offensive side's favor. And also on a more local level, having control over a slightly higher elevated surface like the one south of Selydove, it does provide a very good launch pad for future attacks, as we saw with the Russian advances occurring over the past few days along the rail line deeper towards Vishneva. And this is something that is not confirmed yet. Russian sources are widely reporting this, and I'm trying to be very cautious with my reporting because I haven't been keeping track of events that closely over these past 3 days. I'm just recounting them as I go. And you could see that some Russian sources are discussing a Russian entrance into Vishneve, which would look something like this. That implication would be that the actual physical connection between the rear, and you do have a very extensive rear apparatus that runs along these rail lines and just paved routes. I suppose it comes from Pokrovsk, or not necessarily as much now, but you can see how it sort of starts in Novotroitsk and then runs along this chain of diagonal villages all the way to Vishneve. And now that potentially that route is cut off, which would mean that in terms of physical routes through which the Ukrainians could supply the remaining, western half of Selydove, they have this one paved road that branches out from the E50 highway. You could see it marked over here in red for you guys. And then it makes its way all the way to Kozatska Road. And then from there, branches out into the various micro districts of western Selydove. And that road, of course, it branches off of the vertical highway that connects to Pokrovsk. And this is why, again, Pokrovsk is such an important city, even now that it is relatively close to the front line, like 10 kilometers away. You could see how much of a web is formed around it. You could see it actually with the circular perimeter of Pokrovsk with all the roads that then go in separate directions. And then it just so happens that one of the directions is southeastwards towards Selydove, and then more generally towards various Russian towns. Towns that the Russians have been able to recently capture over the past 2 to 3 months. So again, you have this concerted efforts to advance along the southern flank, and that, of course, forced the Ukrainians to divert a lot of resources in those directions. but there wasn't as much they can do to grind it down in an urban setting because the Russians were advancing through open areas. And so it sort of forces the Ukrainians to go out of their basements and begin to engage in on surface face to face battles. And that's when they become exposed to artillery and airstrikes by the Russian side. And of course, as you may know, around the night of October 21st, you had a massive uptick in Russian shelling, just substantial, as reported by the 15th Brigade, something that they had not experienced over the past month or month and a half. So that was clearly a sign of a significant preparation from three axes, one of which is, of course, the southern axis, which we talked about. But you can see that it's much more than that, because at the same time, you had this Russian attack occurring along the Mikhailivka axis, with the Russians getting full control over the Mikhailivka village, including all of the dachas in the western portion of that settlement, then utilizing those houses and the roads that, of course, connect them all together as forward launch pads. And the 433rd Regiment, I'm going to talk about them in a second, but they use Selydove Avenue and more generally the route over here that was practically open to make it all the way to the southern central parts of Selydove. And this was recorded on footage that was geolocated on October 23rd. And there's actually several shoots of this same apartment building being having a flag hoisted above it or on one of the balconies over there. And that is an indication that not only was there a Russian flag, because then, of course, there's some sort of plausible deniability that there's no longer Russian soldiers there or that a drone dropped it, but then there were several pieces of footage coming out from that same location that I have marked over here in blue that indicates that there were actually Russian soldiers here and they filmed it. So this is solid proof that the Russian forces were actually able to make a very deep penetration past the Ukrainian line, past the perimeter they've been holding for like a month and a half now. And that shows that the Ukrainians in this region, despite their best efforts when it comes to a large influx of reinforcements and setting up this defensive perimeter across an urban area, it was only able to hold on for about a month and a half. And you could see similar trends again with the way in which there was difficulty holding on to towns like Novohordivka, most of Hordivka, for instance, Ukrainsk. I think we're seeing it now also with Hirnyk. These sort of medium-sized settlements, and Selydove is one of the larger ones, but they simply do not have the wherewithal to hold on as much as areas that probably were prepared for much longer and were more well defended across their, I suppose, eastern perimeter, in this case with Selydove. And it's also just the culmination of a lot of the preparation and the groundwork done by the Russians due to attrition rates, due to the resources allocated to the sector over here. Because again, you're looking at the 15th Brigade being the lead unit over here and largely relying on FPV squads to conduct attacks towards Russian soldiers. I don't necessarily know how strong the artillery rationing is over here, but it would probably be a significant disadvantage, especially in recent days when the Russians started to uptake it with a lot of the artillery batteries coming in from the northwestern parts of Donetsk, getting involved. And you do have a large utilization of BM-21 Grads, for instance, D-30s being involved now in the shelling. And it's not just against the 115th, not just against the 15th Brigade, but there are some other units here. I would call them ancillary units because they're not necessarily providing as much of infantry support, but you have the 117th Mechanized Brigade over here. Certain elements of the 59th Brigade should be around here, but the majority of the unit is located further south. And so then eventually, due to the mismatch in manpower, because again, the Russians do outman them over here as well by a magnitude that you can see based on the unit allocations. So you have several territorial motorized rifle regiments that have been able to rotate in and out of the fighting. There are so many of these, new regiments, territorial units that were created over the past year that you see a shift. Some of them were engaged last year in the Avdiivka region, then you just completely forgot about them. Some of them were engaged in the August attacks, and since then we just haven't had a record of their activity. And now these new units are appearing that I suppose are more fresh. I don't know about their experience levels, but they are also located in this part of the front line, and they're able to, of course, conduct rotations and replace previous units that were involved in very long-lasting and very heavy offensive activity. So you have the 433rd Motor Rifle Regiment of the 27th Motor Rifle Division. I think this division made out of the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade. So the brigade was promoted into a division due to the size and due to the want to create these new regiments with probably new soldiers, new recruits that were coming in. and then having some sort of like larger umbrella to operate within. So this regiment, it suffered some relatively heavy losses in the Charatina region, and since then it's been restaffed, and a lot of the companies have been refurbished, and now it's once again engaged in the fighting. It's at the forefront of the attacks, and they're the ones who actually raise the flags in central Selydove. If you're looking at the extent of the Russian advance here, and I do think that you could see, based on the lack of clashes in eastern Selydove, that it was just a complete break in the line. It was sort of this boiling point where at a certain point in time, the factors in relation to elevation, flanks, lack of defensive positions, attrition, lack of proper rationing of shells after an extended period of time, general fatigue, all of that combined together with then the Russians uptaking the assault operations on several axes. That's what basically pushed the Ukrainians out. And then you had the decision of local Ukrainian company or battalion commanders to let go of a lot of these regions without a fight and coalesce around the center of Selydove. Probably the higher ups wouldn't have even made that much of a difference when it comes to ordering troops on where to stay, because at some point, whether you stay in a certain static position or withdraw becomes spontaneous and really is up to the individual soldier. But we can see some incidents, not that many, of fighting. So here you have the 433rd Regiment. They had an RPG-7 hit a Ukrainian Kozak infantry mobility vehicle, and they also took 2 POWs that were not able to withdraw in time. So again, you're looking at such a large surface area that inevitably there's going to be small squads that aren't able to make it out, and then that's when you see some of the clashes. So you're seeing a Russian advance at most of 3.5 kilometers from the previous outskirts of Mikhailivka, and it's being done through, at first, less dense regions, some dacha regions, and then eventually you reach the southern part of Selydove, which becomes much more dense. Start us out with some private residential areas, but you have the hospital region that the Russians have now taken over. You have the southern center, which includes some high-rise buildings. It includes local grocery stores, pharmacies, whatever it may be. All of these facilities are areas where the Ukrainians previously would have held positions, and they have actually good basements over there to sleep in and operate throughout the day. And of course, drone crews, they coordinate their activities in those regions. And here you could actually see the perspective, because the Russians, they raise their flag over here, somewhere over here. And then you can see the Solona River. I'll mark it for you guys in red. And you could see now that the northern apartment complexes north of the Solona River, those are the ones that are being heavily contested at the moment, with the Russian forces in control of the southern tip. And they want to get control over the, I suppose, northwestern tip, if you would like to refer to it as that, with this green X over here. So on my map, I have this folder for you guys if you want to click on it. I don't really show videos of war footage on my channel, just because my connection is so slow that I can't even afford to do it. But over here, as you look at the northern parts of Selydove, north of the Solona River, there is a bit of a gray zone. This is still being clarified whether there are still Ukrainian forces operating in these apartment complexes. I'd say they probably are, just due to how well defended they could be feasibly, even with a small amount of forces still operating there. Concrete slabs and massive stories. It's just simply a position that you would not want to give up without a fight. So even though all of the private residential areas nearby were yielded by the Ukrainians, and the Russians were able to push through very quickly, 1.2 kilometers to be exact, the actual citadel is something that I could see the Ukrainians try to hold on to for the short term, at least, in order to buy some more time and hold out on the eastern axis, the direct attack into the center of Selydove, because these are really their best positions left in the entire city. If you look elsewhere, there are also some relatively strong positions in the northwestern portion, but it is really isolated from the entirety of the city. So really, it's important for the center to be at the very least contested, not under Russian control, because then the Russians will, of course, exert their dominance and branch out, using the roads and using the apartment buildings to provide cover for themselves. And as you zoom in, you'll see that the Russian forces, they've attacked not just along the direct Centralna axis over here into the southern part of Selydove, which was axis number 2, but also axis number 3, which is occurring around here, the northern part of the front line. So I talked about this very briefly in some of my earlier videos, and I was warning about the potential for a breakthrough in this region, and now you can see how it actually materialized. Because you have these polygons over here that sort of branched out. You can see how they're unorthodox in their positioning. That's because some Russian squads, they were able to break through the Ukrainian lines, make it into the southern portions of the Kurakhove mine, a lot of the offices and facilities here. On October 10th, You had a lot of operations by the 1st Battalion of the 15th Brigade to target Russian squads that were crossing over. Here's from October 20th. This is a video from the 2nd Battalion of their grenades dropping on Russian soldiers and just generally FPV strikes onto the Korchenka mine facilities. And from there, even acknowledged by Ukrainian sources, at the very least, the southern half of the mine of the Terrakon, has been taken over by the Russians. And that's just a perfect vantage point to directly overlook the Shakhtar Stadium, the local park, the duplexes, basically everything that also leads into it. That's also important to note. So, in terms of local geography, this is one of the most critical pieces. And now the Russians are either in control of it or they are in a gray zone. Really, with the Russians striving to take over those particular portions of the front line. So, really, I do think that this is indicative of what happens after sustained Russian pressure on a city with concerted efforts with several regiments and brigades operating across several flanks to put pressure, and then the Ukrainians not having the sufficient reinforcements or material to hold on for a long period of time. And also, of course, you have to keep in mind that the Ukrainians were not expecting to defend in Selydove at this point in time. Their time frames were just completely wrong in terms of their estimates, and it has a lot to do with the initial breakthrough across the Vovcha River and Prokhorez, which really threw the Ukrainians back. They were not expecting that, and ever since they've really been on the retreat, then they stabilized around Selydove, and now you're seeing that it was only temporary state of events because everything underlying the battle, and we've been talking about this for so long, really indicated that eventually there would be some sort of break like we're seeing right now. In terms of some other unit compositions that I find to be interesting, you have the 80th Tank Regiment. They're operating generally around here. You have this unit over here, 35th Motor Rifle Brigade. I've now confirmed that they're operating generally between Selydove and the Pokrovsk region, because a lot of these brigades, definitely a year ago, they were around Avivka, but then you don't have as much open source information about the recent movements. So I've just been checking the status of a lot of these units before moving them around. You have this unit over here, the 100, we talked about it. You have the 55th Mountain Motor Rifle Brigade. You have here 228th Motor Rifle Brigade. Not to get too repetitive, but more generally, you have 27th Motor Rifle Division operating around here. You have elements of the 150th Division operating a bit further southwards, as we'll get to in a second. You have the 51st Combined Arms Army, which is actually the former 1st Army Corps, so all the DPR units, they're really considered within that umbrella. And then you have all these territorial units that they have very split allegiances and umbrellas, so there's not one way to categorize them, but they're all marked over here on my map. Looking a bit to the south, I want to focus on Kurnia, just to the west of it. You can see your Russian advance amounting to 5 square kilometers. In comparison, you can see the Russian advances in Selydove amounted to 2.7 square kilometers, and then also this polygon here indicates 13.3 square kilometers. So you're looking at 16 square kilometers. And then here, west of Kurnia, Russian advance amounting to, 2 kilometers westwards. Based on this geolocation from October 23rd, this is from the 80th Tank Regiment that I was talking about a second ago. So they were involved in overrunning a local Ukrainian stronghold. If I had to guess, it's this one over here. And they engaged with a Bradley that was actually supposed to evacuate the wounded from that area. So they destroyed the Bradley. This is according to them that it's a Bradley, but you could see definitely that there's a destroyed Ukrainian vehicle with a Russian tricolor flying over it. So definitely that confirms Russian presence over here, and that they were able to overrun the stronghold. The Russian side, they claim that all of the Ukrainian forces that were resisting here, 16 of them were killed, and then 4 that were left were wounded, but were able to make it out and retreat towards the Ukrainian lines. So that's their claim, but I haven't seen evidence of it yet. But they are claiming that they're going to show footage of this supposed Ukrainian stronghold, which again, I do believe is this. And that will indicate that they've been able to eject the Ukrainians from the nearby sort of like western outskirts of Kurnia, because you do have several Ukrainian positions that had to be cleared out in this region, including also the warehouses. So the warehouses have also been taken over by the Russians in recent days, as you can see based on the yellow mapping. And also a bit to the north, you could see how there's sort of been a branching out west of the rail line. And this is very important because you have this really large hill, this really large ridge, which extends from Russian-controlled territory all the way into this region just south of Novo Oleksivka. And this provides the perfect sort of elevation overview to overlook the chain of villages leading into Selydove, like Vishneve, Hirnyk, Petrivka. All these villages would be completely overlooked if the Russians got full control over this ridge. And then it would also give the Russians this sort of like forward salient to really push deep and push into the Ukrainian strategic depth in this region, into the rear. And that's really the big fear with Selydove in general, that losing it and losing the nearby villages would create a cascading effect that would really prevent the Ukrainians from solidifying a solid line all the way until this area 15 kilometers away, 14 kilometers between Novotroitsk and Novoolenivka, where currently they're building a line to defend against the vertical highway. So that's something that's very important to keep in the midterm in mind. And I'm not going to say long term, but I think that it's actually in the midterm. And to look at the, I guess you could refer to it as a Hirnyk front at this point, as really all the walls are closing in on that settlement. You could see first a very strong Russian effort into Novoselidivka and Izmailivka, a push that you can see over here from October 23rd, based on FPV strikes onto Russian forces and warehouses in the eastern portion of Novoselidivka. It backs up reports by the Russian side that they've been able to infiltrate. And again, this is a relatively small settlement, and given all of the movement that is occurring northwards, the village is now in an uncomfortable position because the Russians, they have routes directly feeding into it and into its neighbors, such as Kremenabalka and Voznezenka. So all those villages, this cluster of settlements, is actually under a lot of threat, and losing control over these three villages would entail the Russian forces being able to push along the rail line all the way to the Kurakhove reservoir. You could see that it would only be 5 kilometers away, and then it would put a lot of pressure on the flanks of Kurakhivka, Hirnyk, all of those villages, and all the troops there, which is several battalions of troops, would be under threat of complete encirclement. And that is the huge fear. And that's why I do think that the Ukrainians, they do definitely need to attend to holding on to here, just to have at the very least some sort of stabilization measure. But then the downside is that those forces are being redirected from positions in Hirnyk or Kurakhivka or the Vavcha River. And so either way, there are holes that cannot be attended to that eventually begin to leak. And you can see that right here with the sort of culmination of the Russian advance into Novoselidivka and then also into Izmailivka based on this video over here. From the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade from the DPR, they raised the victory flag in western Izmailivka. This came after very significant shelling by, again, BM-21s and the D-30s into the outskirts of Hirnyk and into the city center as well. And again, you're looking at D-30s. They're 15 to 22 kilometers away from the front line in terms of their max operational range, depending on the iteration. And so, again, a lot of these regions that have recently been taken over by the Russians, whether they be to the north near Ukrainsk, to the east around the Vavcha River salient, those regions, they're now going to be converted into very large artillery battery strongholds that can begin pummeling any sort of Ukrainian salient, whether it be around Hirnyk or even around Kurakhove. Those regions will become really subject to intense shelling in the next couple of weeks. And also a lot of the efforts in this region are being conducted by the 110th Motor Rifle Brigade. So you have those two DPR units that have been really heavily involved in assault operations. Before I get to that, though, you do have this Russian advance, as reported by Ukrainian sources, into the northern portions of Hirnyk. That includes getting control over this entire micro district, reaching all the way to this local supermarket, pushing along the main road bisecting the town vertically. But again, there is still some sort of protracted resistance from the Presidential Brigade. Some of its battalions are around here. You have at least the 10th Motorized Battalion of the 59th Brigade. So there's still clashes going on in the private residential areas, in the hospital region, in some of the apartments. So this is just one axis in the wider realm of the battle here. And that's why the Ukrainians are sort of spread out, because also to the east, you have very significant advances by the Russian forces. This includes crossing over the Vavcha River in one of the regions where it was very narrow, using a pontoon, probably around here if I'm going to mark it with a map. And the Russian forces were able to enter into Zoriane. This is a video from the, I believe, 110th. So they raised their flag. They really were able to roam through freely in the main road of Zoriane, and then actually directly connects to Kurakhivka. So now Kurakhivka is going to have to be really trying to prevent any infiltrations, because you can see they don't have static defensive positions on their eastern flank, and they have several roads that are directly feed into Zoriana. So it's going to be really difficult for them to withstand that pressure. And Alexandropil is under intense pressure because it is cornered from three sides, and then the western side is, of course, the river itself. So it's in a conundrum. And then again, you have this advance that occurred in Zelena Druche, one of the final villages east of the Vavcha River. Now you know that the Russian forces have taken it over per Ukrainian sources, and it gives them another vector through which to cross over, because again, the river is very narrow over here. I believe it could be crossed on foot or swimming in certain locations, but even without that, having like a very small pontoon would be enough. And then you could already have a lot of pressure coming onto eastern Hirnyk. So you can see how all directions really are working to develop that town, and it's causing a lot of pressure to divide the Ukrainian forces that are already attrited and already lacking the proper resources. A lot of it in parts due to them being so disconnected from the main part of the front line. So then it becomes riskier to send in large shipments of equipment. And then imagine how Russian FPV crews will begin to react as they establish permanent bases, permanent footholds in Izmailivka and Novoselidivka. Those FPVs, they're going to have ranges that will be able to reach directly into the supply routes that would begin feeding into Kurakhove and Hirnyk along this sort of like light green corridor. So it's not just about mortars, but it's also about FPVs and their crews that are going to become very, very active in this airspace. Now, looking at the Kurakhove front, you're going to see here additional advances near or just south of Ostrivska and west of Maximilianivka. So there's the energetic. I'm totally butchering that name. I think it's Energetic in Ukrainian. It's the name of this agricultural commune that is just west of Maximilianivka. It stretches diagonally all the way into Kurakhove, and I'm marking it over here with an X. So you do have continued Russian advances through that community and through the dachas and gardens over there. Based on a video from the 46th Brigade, they were able to destroy 2 tanks and also, I don't think it was one attack. Actually, the 46th reported on October 22nd 10 attacks, 10 offensive actions by the Russian forces. But this is just one of them that they explicitly recorded and released to the public. And you could see that based on that, they were able to advance along the main road, the Russian forces. And in terms of the distance, they're only about 1.6 kilometers away from Kurakhove. It really is close at this point, as the Russians, they are beginning to solidify themselves. The troops, they're able to enter and convene within the basements of these dachas themselves. And then from there, they can establish a perimeter along this eastern flank and begin the actual attacks in a concerted effort with the force that is currently operating in Ostrivska. So that is a really palpable concern for the Ukrainian forces here. But the 46th Brigade, they definitely have been releasing a lot of footage of their drone crews or their artillery damaging Russian vehicles along the way. And that is completely something that is understandable, because you do have large quantities of Russian armored columns pushing through very, very narrow corridors. And so it's definitely expected that with concentrated firepower, that a lot of them will be damaged along the way. A lot of the, I suppose, the barometer for how successful it would be is not just the percentage of vehicles that are destroyed or damaged, but also whether troops are able to dismount successfully and remain in the positions that are intended during the course of the assault itself. So in terms of the gain itself, you can see that it amounts to just 40 hectares almost. And then looking a bit further south, I do want to show you guys a video which came from the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. So it's of a Leopard 2A4. It destroyed a Russian BTR and also fired towards the nearby Russian squad. It does indicate that now the 33rd Brigade is helping out with the defensive activities here by putting pressure along the southern flank of this very deep Russian salient, the salient that spans all the way from Hirnyk to Ostrivska. So the 33rd Brigade is operating over here. They've been actually for, I believe, almost a year now, and they have a lot of the Western weaponry and vehicles that are perfect for this arena, because you just have this large open field without that many static positions nearby. So they are definitely involved with engaging with the forward Russian forces, putting a lot of pressure along this highway here in order to prevent the Russians from utilizing this access to attack directly into Kurakhove. And so now you're just seeing some of their role manifest itself. Also, looking a bit to the south, you have the Russian forces storming a trench system that is really important to the general cohesion of this sector that is held by the 33rd Brigade. So over here, We don't have confirmation of a massive advance, but it is over here recorded by the 79th Air Assault Brigade, showing the destruction of 5 Russian armored vehicles and 1 tank during an assault towards trenches. In the video itself, you can see that a total of 19 armored vehicles and 4 tanks were utilized, and that you had 3 anti-air guns and 1 tank damaged during that assault, per the Ukrainian claims. They also allege that 24 Russian soldiers were killed and 20 were injured during the attack. They show proof for some of this due to troops, dismounting off of damaged vehicles and then being picked off by grenades, or troops being targeted in trenches that they dismounted into. And that's proof that the Russians were actually able to enter into this defensive fortification, which was the entire goal of the assault, to marginally advance from the highway into the trench region, because it serves as one of Ukraine's final forward defense nodes in this area. And past that point, you do have this large portion, large swaths of fields that are just completely open. Doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to advance through, but they're not as dense when it comes to trenches. And so it becomes less difficult and less costly to push through those regions. So now the Russians are just focusing on clearing out the final pockets of Ukrainian resistance within this trench facility. But definitely the 79th Brigade is putting up very, very stiff resistance, yielding a lot of vehicular damage. And it's just interesting because 79th Brigade, whenever they release these pieces of footage, it's very usually around 20 killed, around 20 wounded. Just very similar kill to wounded ratios, and also in absolute terms, very similar numbers of dead and wounded every single time. And I just find that interesting. It could just be a reflection of the number of vehicles utilized each time. But you could see that a lot of it, not all of it, but a large percentage of those claims are substantiated based on the footage they have provided. And now to look at what we could refer to as the Uspenivka direction. Here you can see a Russian advance westwards from Kostiantynivka, reaching all the way to Antonivka, the eastern outskirts. Marked in this video is from the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment. They pushed into a house that was occupied by the Ukrainians. The Russian soldiers here, they had 1 wounded, so they had to attend to his needs. And at the same time, they came under heavy Ukrainian drone bombardment. But eventually, they were able to push out the Ukrainian squad that was pinned in one of the houses in the eastern outskirts, and thereby get control over it. This comes at the same time that my reporting earlier in my last video of storming of Kateryivka ended up being correct. I said that there were Russian sources alleging that they were able to make it to the center, but it wasn't confirmed. Well, now it is, because of the 214th UP4 Special Purpose Battalion. They fired onto a Russian vehicle in this video as it was approaching the settlement, and also they conducted operations dropping grenades and mines onto Russian infantry in these houses, private residential areas, and near a school, near the stores in the area. So it is pretty good geolocated evidence to indicate the Russians are in control of at least half of the settlement. And also this means that they are able to put direct pressure onto the southern portions of Antonivka. So you can see already in full swing how the Russians are once again taking out the forward Ukrainian defense nodes along this chain of villages. This chain of villages that extends northwestwards all the way to Uspenivka at some point. Once you measure it out, you can see that it is currently, I want to see the closest possible extent. It is around 10 kilometers away from the front line, and that is one of Russia's longer-term goals in this region. But at the same time, you can see how there's preparation to get control over the southern flank, southern hills that overlook other villages here, like Ilinka or Vesely High, Romo, I can't even see the name of this village. And you can see here the advance is marked with yellow and accounting for 4.2 square kilometers, and over here 3.3 square kilometers. And then in this location, you can see an advance amounting to 4.9 square kilometers respectively. Russian forces there are once again utilizing armored vehicles to dismount forces in forward tree lines, and from there just clear out localized strong points, because you do have these local, I suppose, quadrilateral shaped trenches with just very strong perimeters, but they are isolated from the broader Ukrainian nervous system in this region. So the Russians are trying to isolate them and take them out one by one. A lot of that is being done by putting pressure from the south, but also from the east. So there is a concerted effort to take over any fields nearby and then utilize them to fire upon the Ukrainians that are dug in. They're trying to eliminate any resistance coming in from these trenches in order to really pave the way for a safe entry and occupation of Bohoyavlenka itself. So that's why for now you haven't seen any sort of like direct effort to enter into the village itself. A lot of it is being focused on preparations by attacking the eastern flank and also by solidifying control over all the positions to the south, where you do have a lot of open fields. You have some ravines that lead directly into Bohoyavlenka. You just have some gray zone that has to be attended to. And so that's all that for today. Thank you all for watching. I'm going to definitely expand on this and talk about other parts of the front line in the next video. So thank you all and goodbye.